They told her to handle refreshments because she looked like someone who belonged in the kitchen, not the strategy room. No rank insignia, no name tag, just a quiet woman in standard fatigues carrying a notepad. But when she rolled up her sleeve to organize the documents, what appeared on her arm made every colonel in that room freeze. It wasn't just ink, it was proof of the most elite training program in the military. The same commander who'd been treating her like support staff suddenly couldn't look away, because what he saw meant she'd completed missions that most of his officers had only heard whispers about in classified briefings. Now, before we reveal exactly what happened in that Pentagon conference room, smash that like button and tell us in the comments what country you're watching from, because this commander learned never to judge a soldier by their assignment again. The quarterly review at Joint Base Andrews was supposed to be routine. Another status meeting, another room full of senior officers discussing international operations while someone else managed the logistics. Someone disposable, someone like Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez. She didn't stand out walking into Conference Room 12B that Wednesday morning. Standard digital camouflage uniform, no visible unit patches, no colorful service ribbons across her chest. Hair secured in regulation style, every detail perfect but unremarkable. She carried a tablet in one hand and a coffee thermos in the other, moving with the practiced efficiency that made people assume she belonged exactly where they expected, in the background, handling details the important people didn't want to bother with. The briefing room hummed with conversation when she entered. 4 full colonels gathered around the main table studying intelligence reports spread across the polished surface. 2 lieutenant colonels reviewed deployment schedules by the windows. At the room's center, Commander James Mitchell examined his notes with the laser focus that had earned him command of Joint Special Operations Coordination. None of them acknowledged her entrance. Why would they? Maya moved along the room's edge, setting up the refreshment station with mechanical precision. Fresh coffee filters, cream dispensers, sugar packets in perfect rows. The routine preparation that kept high-level meetings functioning while decision-makers focused on strategy. Maya had performed this role before, in rooms like this for officers like these. She understood the hierarchy of military meetings with crystalline clarity. The colonels would discuss operational parameters while lieutenant colonels handled logistical details. The commander would make final decisions while staff sergeants like her ensured the administrative machinery ran smoothly. Everyone had their place, their role, their level of importance, and Maya's level, according to everyone present, was several rungs below anyone who mattered. Miss, Colonel Robert Hayes called without looking up from his documents. Make sure we have copies of the operational summary for when General Torres arrives, and some of those muffins from the commissary would be good. Maya nodded. Yes, sir. When the general gets here, added Colonel Jennifer Walsh, organizing her briefing materials, his coffee should be strong, 2 sugars. He's specific about that. Understood, ma'am. They addressed her like essential equipment, functional, required, but not quite human. Maya recognized that tone, those dismissive glances that looked through her as if she were part of the administrative infrastructure keeping military bureaucracy operational. Another enlisted soldier managing grunt work while real leaders handled strategy. What none of them knew, what they couldn't have guessed from her unremarkable uniform and quiet manner, was that Maya Rodriguez had spent the past year doing things that would haunt most of them if they knew the details. Things that happened in places that didn't appear on any official maps, involving targets whose names were redacted from intelligence briefings these officers would never see. But that revelation was 25 minutes away. For now, she remained the refreshment coordinator, invisible and forgettable, exactly as she intended. Maya had discovered long ago that being underestimated was often the most effective weapon available. People revealed information when they believed you didn't matter. They dropped their guard when they assumed you posed no threat. And they made tactical mistakes when they failed to properly assess all the assets in their operational environment. Maya's background appeared deliberately ordinary in official records. Standard enlisted advancement through the ranks, clean service history, competent but unremarkable performance evaluations. The kind of military career that never attracted scrutiny from personnel reviewers or raised questions during security clearance investigations. Everything about Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez suggested she was precisely what she appeared, a reliable, competent, completely forgettable component in the vast machinery of military logistics. That was exactly the intention. After her last deployment, after everything that had happened in the mountains of Afghanistan, the Army had decided that Maya Rodriguez needed to disappear for a while. Not permanently, just long enough for certain situations to cool down and for her to recover from injuries that didn't appear on any official medical records. So they buried her real service record under layers of bureaucratic paperwork and assigned her to the most boring, unremarkable position they could find. administrative support at a joint command base, handling logistics for senior staff meetings, filing reports that nobody would ever read twice, managing coffee service and document distribution for officers who looked through her like she was furniture. It was supposed to be temporary rehabilitation duty disguised as a routine assignment, giving her time to heal both physically and psychologically from trauma that couldn't be discussed in polite company. The problem with being exceptionally good at staying invisible was that eventually someone always noticed. Maya had been playing this role for 8 months now, long enough to understand the rhythms and personalities of Joint Base Andrews' command structure. She knew which officers preferred their briefings on paper versus digital displays, which colonels needed extra time to review operational summaries and which could be counted on to arrive late and need their materials reorganized on the fly. She was the person who ensured coffee stayed fresh, conference rooms were properly equipped, and classified documents were distributed to the right people with appropriate security clearances. It was work that kept military bureaucracy functioning smoothly while remaining completely invisible to the people who benefited from it. Maya had grown to appreciate the anonymity. Being essential but unnoticed gave her access to information in meetings that most people at her rank would never see. She could observe decision-making processes, understand command relationships, and maintain situational awareness without anyone questioning why she was always present when important conversations happened. Today was different, though. Today she was filling in for Master Sergeant Williams, who'd called in sick with what sounded like pneumonia. That meant Maya was handling logistics for a briefing several pay grades above her usual assignments. Joint operations planning, classified mission reviews, the kind of meeting where colonels and commanders discuss things that never made it into official reports. She'd arrived early to set everything up properly, check the secure communications equipment, arrange seating according to rank and security clearance, ensured all classified materials were properly accounted for and locked in appropriate safes until the meeting began. By the time the first officers started arriving, everything was in perfect order, and Maya had positioned herself exactly where she needed to be to remain useful but unnoticed. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, preparing to serve coffee and take notes for a room full of officers planning operations she knew more about than they realized. But that was the game she'd chosen to play, and she'd gotten very good at it over the years. Being underestimated had served her well in situations far more dangerous than a Pentagon briefing room. Commander Mitchell arrived exactly on schedule, which was 15 minutes early. You could sense his presence before you saw him, not because he was loud, but because everything about the man commanded attention. Sharp uniform with every ribbon and medal positioned with mathematical precision, silver oak leaves gleaming under fluorescent lights, and that particular way of carrying himself that suggested he'd never encountered a problem he couldn't solve with superior tactics and strategic thinking. He was the kind of commander who'd earned his position through field commands, not Pentagon politics. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, and enough classified operations that his official biography read like a heavily redacted document. The rumors said he'd personally led special operations missions that most people would only hear about in Hollywood movies, but Mitchell never discussed those days. He didn't need to. Everything about his bearing suggested a man who'd seen combat and emerged with his principles intact. When he walked into conference room 12B, the entire energy shifted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Officers straightened in their chairs, and everyone suddenly appeared more competent than they'd been 30 seconds earlier. Mitchell had that effect on people, not through intimidation exactly, but through the kind of quiet authority that came from having made life-and-death decisions under pressure. He surveyed the room with methodical attention, conducting a tactical assessment. His eyes swept across satellite photos, classified briefing materials, assembled staff officers, taking inventory of everything and everyone present. When his gaze passed over Maya, standing quietly near the refreshment station, it didn't linger. She was part of the background, exactly where she belonged in his mental map of the meeting space. "Ladies, gentlemen," Mitchell said, his voice carrying easily without being raised. "Let's proceed." Colonel Hayes immediately launched into the operational overview, using digital displays to highlight key positions on satellite imagery. The mission parameters were classified, but the general framework was familiar enough. Joint operations planning, coordination between service branches, complex logistical challenges requiring input from multiple commands, and careful attention to political sensitivities. Maya listened with the detached professionalism of someone whose job involved note-taking and administrative details. She understood more of the tactical discussion than anyone present would have expected, but her role was remaining invisible while ensuring smooth meeting operation. That meant keeping coffee fresh, monitoring classified documents, and being ready to handle any logistical issues that might arise. Commander Mitchell asked pointed questions about force deployment timelines and communications protocols. Colonel Walsh provided detailed assessments of intelligence requirements and operational security concerns. The conversation moved with focused intensity that suggested everyone present understood the stakes involved in whatever operation they were planning. Maya found herself analyzing the tactical discussion despite her official role as administrative support. The mission they were outlining had several vulnerabilities that nobody seemed to be addressing. Communication dead zones in the target area, limited extraction options if things went wrong, insufficient intelligence on enemy force disposition. These were the kinds of details that could turn a successful operation into a catastrophe, and she could see the planning gaps clearly from her position in the background. But pointing out tactical flaws wasn't part of her current job description. She was there to serve coffee and take notes, not provide strategic input. So she remained silent, filing away her observations while maintaining the facade of someone whose concerns didn't extend beyond administrative logistics. 25 minutes into the briefing, Mitchell glanced toward the refreshment station and caught Maya's eye with a slight nod. She understood immediately, moving forward with the coffee thermos to refresh his cup. It was a routine interaction, the kind of small service that happened dozens of times in meetings like this one. As she approached the conference table, Colonel Walsh was explaining intelligence coordination protocols in detail. Maya waited for a natural pause in the discussion before stepping forward to refill Mitchell's cup. She'd performed this action countless times in similar meetings, moving efficiently around senior officers without disrupting the flow of important tactical planning. But this time would be different. This time, something as simple as reaching across a conference table would change everything about how everyone in that room saw Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez. She just didn't know it yet. The moment Commander Mitchell nodded toward his coffee cup, Maya moved forward with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd served in countless briefings just like this one. She approached the conference table during a natural pause in the discussion, thermos in hand, ready to top off his cup without disrupting the flow of important tactical planning. Colonel Hayes was in the middle of explaining force deployment schedules when Maya stepped up beside Mitchell's chair. She could hear Colonel Walsh asking questions about intelligence coordination from across the table, but her focus was on the simple task at hand. Pour the coffee, step back, remain invisible. Mitchell barely acknowledged her presence as she leaned forward to reach his cup. This was routine military courtesy, the kind of small service that happened automatically in senior staff meetings. He continued reviewing the operational timeline spread across the table in front of him, his attention completely focused on the classified mission parameters Colonel Hayes was outlining. Maya lifted the thermos and began pouring fresh coffee into Mitchell's cup, her movements smooth and professional. She'd done this exact same action hundreds of times before in meetings just like this one for officers just like him. There was nothing different about today, nothing special about this particular moment that should have drawn anyone's attention. But as she reached across the table to avoid spilling coffee on the classified documents spread across the surface, her uniform sleeve pulled back slightly, exposing her left forearm more fully than usual. It was a minor wardrobe adjustment, the kind of thing that happens when you're stretching to reach something while trying to be careful about where you're pouring hot liquid. The movement was so subtle that most people wouldn't have noticed it at all. Colonel Hayes was still talking about deployment schedules. Colonel Walsh was taking notes on intelligence requirements. The other officers were focused on operational timelines and logistical challenges. None of them noticed that their commanding officer had just gone completely silent. On Maya's exposed forearm, clearly visible now that her sleeve had shifted, was a tattoo that made Mitchell's breath catch in his throat. Not just any tattoo, the distinctive wings and sword design that marked someone as Delta Force qualified. The same insignia that fewer than 100 women in military history had earned the right to wear permanently on their skin. Mitchell's mind raced through everything he knew about Delta Force training and the women who'd attempted it over the years. The numbers were brutal, devastating, almost incomprehensible. Out of thousands of candidates who started the selection process, only a microscopic percentage made it through to graduation. And among women who'd attempted the course, the success rate was even more crushing. He could count on one hand the number of women who'd earned the right to wear that tattoo. Maya stepped back from the table, professional and efficient as always, ready to return to her position near the back wall. But Mitchell's eyes followed her movement now, seeing details that had been invisible to him just moments before. The way she balanced on the balls of her feet, ready to move in any direction. The way her free hand remained relaxed but positioned where she could react quickly if needed. The way her eyes briefly scanned the room's exits before settling back into a neutral expression. These weren't the habits of a staff sergeant who'd spent her career handling administrative duties. These were the instincts of someone who'd been trained to survive in hostile environments where a moment's inattention could be fatal. Someone who'd learned to assess threats and identify escape routes as automatically as breathing. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Mitchell said quietly, his voice cutting through Colonel Hayes's presentation like a knife through fabric. The entire room went silent. Every officer at the table turned to look at their commanding officer, then followed his gaze to Maya, who had frozen near the refreshment station with the thermos still in her hands. You could have heard a pin drop in that suddenly quiet room. Sir, Maya responded, her voice steady and professional. But Mitchell could see something change in her posture. A subtle shift that suggested she knew something significant had just happened, even if she wasn't sure exactly what it was. Mitchell set his coffee cup down carefully, never taking his eyes off her face. The classified operational plan spread across the table suddenly seemed far less important than the woman standing 10 feet away from him. That's an interesting tattoo you have there. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Colonel Hayes looked confused, glancing between his commanding officer and the staff sergeant who was supposed to be handling refreshments. Colonel Walsh stopped taking notes entirely, her pen hovering over the legal pad as she tried to understand what was happening. Maya glanced down at her exposed forearm and realized with crystalline clarity that her carefully constructed cover had just been blown. Her expression didn't change dramatically, but there was a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was rapidly calculating her options and coming up short on viable alternatives. It represents my previous assignment, sir, she said carefully, which was technically true but completely inadequate as an explanation for what Mitchell was seeing. Mitchell leaned back in his chair, studying her with the kind of intense focus he usually reserved for enemy positions he was planning to attack. He'd spent enough time in special operations communities to recognize the real thing when he saw it, and everything about Maya's reaction told him he'd just stumbled onto something significant. Which unit? He asked, his voice carrying the weight of command authority. The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Everyone in the room was now staring at Maya, waiting for an answer that would explain why their commanding officer had suddenly become fascinated with a staff sergeant's body art. But Mitchell already knew the answer, and he suspected Maya knew that he knew. The only question now was whether she was going to continue pretending to be someone she wasn't, or if she was finally going to reveal who Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez really was beneath that carefully constructed facade of administrative competence. The silence stretched out until it became uncomfortable, filled with the kind of tension that suggested everyone present understood they were witnessing something important, even if they didn't fully understand what it was yet. Maya Rodriguez had been in worse situations than this, much worse. She'd been pinned down by enemy fire in Helmand Province with nothing but a sidearm and a wounded teammate who couldn't move. She'd infiltrated terrorist compounds where discovery meant torture and death. She'd completed selection exercises in conditions that would have killed most people before they'd even started. But standing in Conference Room 12B at Joint Base Andrews, holding a thermos while a room full of senior officers stared at her, felt like one of the most dangerous moments of her recent career. Not because her life was in immediate physical danger, but because everything she'd worked to build over the past 8 months was about to come crashing down. Maya looked directly at Commander Mitchell, making the tactical decision that honesty was now her only viable option. She could continue the charade, claim the tattoo was something else, or some convenient lie, but Mitchell's expression told her he wouldn't accept anything less than the truth. First Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, sir. Selection Class 2304. The words fell into the silence like grenades with their pins pulled. Colonel Hayes actually dropped his pen. The sound of it hitting the polished conference table echoed in the absolute quiet. Colonel Walsh's mouth opened slightly, then closed without making a sound. The other officers around the table looked like they were trying to process information that didn't fit with anything they thought they knew about the world. Commander Mitchell nodded slowly, as if Maya had just confirmed something he'd already suspected. Completion status. Graduated with distinction, sir. 18 months operational deployment following selection. The room remained absolutely quiet. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to be breathing normally. The revelation that their refreshment coordinator was actually Delta Force had fundamentally altered everyone's understanding of reality. It was like discovering that the janitor was actually a brain surgeon, or that the secretary was a former CIA operative, which, Maya reflected grimly, wasn't that far from the truth. What was your last operational assignment? Mitchell asked, his voice taking on the tone of a commanding officer conducting a formal debriefing. Sir, I'm not certain this is the appropriate venue for that discussion, Maya said carefully. She was walking a tightrope between military protocol and operational security, trying to satisfy Mitchell's curiosity without revealing classified information to people who didn't have the proper clearance levels. Mitchell understood immediately. Whatever Maya's last mission had been, it was classified at a level that excluded most of the officers currently present. He made a quick decision, the kind of command judgment that separated effective leaders from bureaucrats who followed procedure manuals. "Colonel Hayes, Colonel Walsh, I need you to step outside for a few minutes." Hayes started to protest. "Sir, we're in the middle of operational planning." "Now, Colonel." Mitchell's voice carried the kind of authority that didn't allow for discussion or delay. The two colonels exchanged glances, clearly frustrated at being excluded from what had become the most interesting briefing either of them had attended in months. But orders were orders, and Commander Mitchell outranked everyone in the room by a considerable margin. They gathered their materials and filed out of the conference room, leaving Mitchell alone with Maya and the lingering smell of fresh coffee. The door clicked shut with a finality that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room. Mitchell waited until he was certain they were completely alone before continuing his questioning. "Now," he said, settling back in his chair, "what really happened in Afghanistan?" Maya felt her carefully constructed composure crack slightly. Afghanistan wasn't supposed to be common knowledge. The operations she'd been involved in there were buried under so many layers of classification that most people with commander-level security clearances would never see the reports. "How do you know about Afghanistan, sir?" Mitchell smiled grimly. "Because I read the after-action reports, all of them, including the ones with your name redacted but your operational signature all over them." Maya realized she'd been outmaneuvered by someone who'd done his homework more thoroughly than she'd anticipated. Mitchell wasn't just asking random questions about her background. He knew exactly who she was and what she'd been doing before her assignment to Andrews. The only question was how much he knew about the things that had gone wrong. "The compound infiltration mission, sir. High-value target extraction. Intelligence suggested Taliban leadership meeting in Kandahar province." Mitchell nodded. "Mission success. Target eliminated. Intelligence recovered. Minimal friendly casualties." He paused, studying her face. "But something went wrong during extraction." Maya's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The successful target elimination was the part of the mission that had made it into official reports and commendation recommendations. What happened afterward was the part that had landed her in a military hospital for 6 weeks and eventually led to her current assignment serving coffee at staff meetings. "Ambush during exfiltration, sir. Pre-positioned IED combined with small arms fire. Hit our convoy 2 kilometers from the target site. Your team leader was killed," Mitchell said, though it wasn't really a question. "Master Sergeant Collins, along with Sergeant First Class Martinez and Staff Sergeant Kim. I was the only survivor from the primary assault element." Mitchell had read the classified reports about that mission. He knew that Maya had been trapped in the overturned vehicle for nearly 6 hours before rescue teams could extract her. He knew about the shrapnel that had come within millimeters of severing her spinal cord and the internal injuries that required multiple surgeries to repair. What the reports couldn't convey was the psychological impact of losing an entire team and surviving when better soldiers hadn't. "How long were you hospitalized?" Mitchell asked gently. 8 weeks active treatment, another 3 months of physical therapy. But the doctors cleared me for full operational duty. The assignment here is just temporary until command decides where to place me next." Commander Mitchell sat back in his chair, processing everything Maya had just revealed. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place now, creating a picture that was both impressive and heartbreaking. Here was a woman who'd survived the most brutal training program in the military, completed classified combat missions that most people would never hear about, and lost her entire team in an operation that would still be classified as successful because the primary objectives had been achieved. And for the past 8 months, she'd been serving coffee and filing paperwork because the Army didn't know what else to do with a hero who'd been too broken to fight but too valuable to discharge. "The medical reports," Mitchell said carefully, "are they accurate?" Maya understood what he was really asking. Military medical evaluations after traumatic injuries were notorious for their conservative assessments. Doctors erred on the side of caution, keeping valuable personnel in non-combat roles longer than might be strictly necessary. "Physically, I'm ready," Maya said. "All the injuries healed properly. Range of motion is back to 100%. Strength and endurance are actually better than pre-deployment levels." Mitchell heard what she wasn't saying in the careful way she'd phrased her response. "And psychologically?" Maya was quiet for a long moment, staring at the conference table where classified operational plans were still spread across the mahogany surface. She had been avoiding this conversation for months, deflecting questions from military psychologists and command staff who wanted to know if she was ready to return to active duty. The truth was complicated in ways that didn't fit neatly into medical evaluation forms. "I think about them," she said finally. "Collins, Martinez, Kim, not nightmares exactly, just dreams where they're still alive and we're planning the next mission. I wake up expecting to see them in the team room and then I remember they're not coming back. Mitchell nodded. He'd lost good people under his command over the years, knew the weight of survivors' guilt and how it could eat away at even the strongest soldiers. The fact that Maya was still dealing with psychological aftermath from Afghanistan didn't make her weak. If anything, it proved she'd cared deeply about her teammates. "What do you want?" Mitchell asked. "Not what the Army wants, not what the doctors recommend, not what looks good on your service record, but what do you actually want to do?" Maya looked up at him with surprise. Nobody had asked her that question in months. Everyone had been focused on her medical status, her psychological evaluation scores, her fitness for duty assessments, but nobody had simply asked her what she wanted her future to look like. "I want to return to operational status, sir. Not because I'm running away from what happened in Afghanistan, but because I know I can still make a difference. The skills are still there. The training is still solid. I just need the right opportunity to prove that I'm ready." Mitchell studied her face, looking for any sign of uncertainty or false bravado. What he saw was someone who'd been honest about her limitations but was ready to move beyond them. Someone who understood the cost of leadership but was willing to accept that responsibility again. "What if I told you I might have that opportunity?" Mitchell said. For the first time in 8 months, Maya felt something shift inside her chest, like a gear that had been stuck finally clicking into place. She was having a conversation about her future instead of her past. "What kind of opportunity, sir?" Mitchell glanced toward the door, ensuring privacy. "The operational planning we were discussing before this conversation started. Joint special operations, classified mission parameters, the kind of work that requires someone with very specific skill sets, people who've proven they can make good decisions under pressure and adapt when situations deteriorate." "Which they always do," Maya said. "Which they always do," Mitchell agreed. "The question is whether you're ready for that level of responsibility again." Maya had been avoiding this question for months, afraid that accepting another leadership role would dishonor her fallen teammates' memory somehow. But sitting in that conference room, looking at Mitchell's expectant face, she realized she'd been thinking about it all wrong. Collins had been the one who'd recommended her for Delta selection in the first place. Martinez and Kim had followed her leadership through a dozen successful missions before the one that went bad. They hadn't died because she'd made poor decisions. They died because war was unpredictable and dangerous. "I'm ready," Maya said, and for the first time in 8 months, she actually meant it. The conversation that followed would change everything, not just for Maya but for the mission planning that had been interrupted by a simple act of serving coffee. Because sometimes the most valuable assets were the ones hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone smart enough to recognize their true potential.